Despite being nominated for 4 Oscars, the movie Train Dreams remains unknown to a lot of people. In its defense, it is only available on Netflix and boasts almost no headlining actors, and was directed by Clint Bentley, who has only directed one other film. And yet, Train Dreams is a film that competes with the most meaningful movies ever created. It isn't the most intense, nor does it have an insane twist, but instead thrives on the emotions of the audience. It's a film that has undeniable happiness, heart-shattering sadness, and a number of deep, pondering moments. This is usually where I would go over the story or the plot of the film, except with Train Dreams I can't really do that. The story of Train Dreams is really just the life of Robert Grenier, a logger in the northern US during the turn of the century and the rise of industrialization. To be honest, the story itself is very boring. Aside from a few standout moments such as the big fire or Arn's death, the plot is very repetitive. Most of the film takes place either in the forests where Robert works, the area in and around his cabin, or the town he lives nearby. And it still works. Despite primarily being set in 3 locations, Train Dreams delivers a story so meaningful. The biggest question is what makes this story so meaningful? If it isn't the plot itself, then how can a film break hearts and strike smiles across the audience? Well, most of it is done through the characters, or rather our main character, Robert Grenier. Robert is a very quiet person who mostly minds his own business and generally spends his time dealing with his own life rather than the lives of those around him. He has very few friends, and even the ones he has, he doesn't seem particularly close with. That is, until he meets Gladys. Gladys is very outgoing and is a very initiative sort of woman, which seems pretty obvious from the beginning. She is the one who walks up to Robert instead of the other way around, and the narrator even takes note of how odd this is. Meeting Gladys is a big stepping stone for Robert, as the audience can see how his mood shifts when he meets her. He went from very stoic to sweet and loving in just a short amount of time. This is only exaggerated as there is a huge comparison drawn between Robert's mood when he's at home versus when he's working in the forests. At home with his family, his voice is sweet and playful, and he's very gentle. On the job, however, he returns to his stoic mannerisms and talks with very few people, and his job is literally to swing an axe to cut down giant trees. Quite the opposite of gentle. This sets up for one of the most emotional sequences I think I've ever seen in cinema. The wildfire sequence is genuinely one of the hardest pieces of film I've ever had to watch. It's not gory, it's not graphic or anything like that, but the subtle dread that builds and then finally climaxes is such a heartbreak to the audience. The build up to this climax is done incredibly well too, as the first shot of the fire is just smoke above the tree line, and at first I actually thought it was just a storm. Then, as Robert gets off the train and there are gasps that erupt throughout the crowd, and in the background, a roaring inferno lights up the sky. Of course, Robert can't find his family anywhere in town, so his only option is to dive headfirst into the danger and walk into the flaming forest itself. The scene in the forest is probably the most intense scene in the whole movie, as the audience, like Robert, holds out some kind of hope that Gladys and his daughter, Katie, will come. It seems like such a movie thing to do, to have all this suspense built up with Robert going into the fire, and just as he's about to collapse, his family runs out to save him, or something like that. But Train Dreams isn't just any movie. It's a movie built on emotions. While not nearly as devastating to the audience as it is to Robert, the death of Gladys and Katie is so immensely depressing. We saw Robert at the beginning of the film how lonely and stoic he was, and then watched as he was cured by this family. To have that ripped away not only turns him back into that lonely individual from the beginning, but also stacks a massive layer of grief upon it. Given that Robert is our protagonist, the audience wants to root for him, but more than that, we've been shown that Robert is a good guy, not only to his family but to the other workers around him. Though he usually keeps to himself, he cares for those he works with, as seen in his reaction when Arn gets hit, and the Asian man on the railroading job. The audience is frequently shown how big of a heart Robert has, so to have such an unfortunate event befall someone like that is really tough to watch. Themes are a huge part of this film, and there are a lot of them. First, the theme of redemption. There are a lot of obvious parallels to be had between the characters of Robert Grenier and Arthur Morgan from Red Dead Redemption 2. Both are countrymen with remarkably similar facial hair, both are gruff and stoic and represent very typical masculine traits, both physically and emotionally. And both stories take place around the same time period, being at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. However, I think that's pretty much where the comparison ends, and my biggest issue with the film arises. The biggest theme in this film is supposed to be redemption, as Robert feels an emotional burden from the incidents in his job working as a railroad constructor, and to some extent his childhood. The film is titled Train Dreams because of the dreams Robert has regarding these incidents, but I don't think they're explained well enough. My interpretation of the dream is that Robert feels some kind of regret for not acting at the scene of the railroad, combined with some mixture from his childhood, hence why it's his childhood self getting run over. Additionally, the film constantly reminds the audience that Robert felt like nature was going to fight back, that he'd lived a bad life that was eventually going to catch up, but we never really see anything like that. Sure, he didn't prevent the railroad incident from occurring, and he cuts down trees for a living, but to base an entire redemption story upon things like that seems a little shallow. Drawing back to the Arthur Morgan comparison, Arthur lives a life of killing and thieving for most of his life. He spends 40 to 50 years doing these objectively bad things, and then struggles to find a way to redeem himself in his head. Compare this to Robert, whose only really malicious actions are not acting enough in a situation he didn't create, and cutting down trees to make money, which is ultimately to provide for his family. Furthermore, we get plenty of scenes of Robert acting as a kind person. He is a sweet and gentle father and cares about the other loggers he works with. At his core, Robert is a compassionate person, even if he doesn't outwardly show it sometimes. It's tough ground to build a redemption arc out of, because there aren't a lot of bad things Robert must redeem himself from. Perhaps there's an element there that I missed, and if so, please let me know, but even then I'm not sure that it was clearly shown enough to make it the title card of the film. There are also a lot of themes of man and nature involved, as seen with the second shot of the film. The shot depicts a logger's boots nailed to the trunk of a tree, something that we see later as a way for loggers to commemorate their fallen workers. However, it also shows a bond between the forces of nature and those of man. This being one of the first shots of the film sets this up nicely, as it's not something we'll learn until a lot later. However, it's a theme that is carried throughout the runtime of the entire film. The fire is a huge example of this theme. As a job, Robert destroys nature, cutting down trees and carving holes through mountains, and eventually nature fights back. There's even a mention of this very idea, as some of the loggers mention the tax on the soul to take part in such massive deforestation. It seems there's no way for man and nature to coexist, as either man overtakes nature with new technology to destroy it faster, or nature kills man and overtakes it, a symbol evident in the moss overgrowing the pair of boots in the opening shot. However, I think Robert as a character exists as a way for the two to exist together. This can be seen in a number of ways, first by the wild dogs. If the dogs exist as a representation for nature, then the relationship between the dogs and Robert symbolizes the coexistence of each. Additionally, Robert attempting to go back into the logging business displays this theme of coexistence. Robert isn't able to return to his former profession not only because of his physical limitations of his age, but also because metaphysically he is the harmony between man and nature. He can't go back to logging because doing so would mean he breaks the harmony between man and nature, and as a symbol for the theme, he just can't do that. The last set of themes are those of loneliness and masculinity. Masculinity is a funny theme in this movie because it simultaneously upholds traditional masculine themes while subverting others. A good example of both is Robert's job and his role at home. Robert's job is incredibly masculine. Swinging an axe and chopping down trees is just a very manly thing to do. But at home, his role is far less masculine, as he goes on a hunting trip with Gladys, but she's the one doing the hunting. Overall, I would say that it's a very masculine movie, especially in the way it shows masculine loneliness. Robert, like many men, has very few real friends, and thus makes his purpose his family. So much so that he works a job that he himself describes as very dangerous. The way he keeps to himself, whether it's sitting in a different fire or making expressions to himself only, it's all very relatable to a lot of men. However, Far and away the most relatable thing is how he never talks about his struggles. His dreams, his reasoning for believing the world is going to bite back, and the sadness he feels about the death of his family, he never mentions it to anyone until the end of the film. His talk with Miss Thompson is so cathartic because it's all this pent-up sadness and grief that he lets out all at once. Once again, going back to the Arthur Morgan comparison, it felt like that scene with Sister Calderon at the train station. If you know, you know. It's a scene where all these struggles that Robert's been facing alone can finally be helped by someone other than Robert. It's among the saddest scenes in the film, but also one of my favorites. Train Dreams is a bit of a different movie to watch. It doesn't have a traditional plot, and our protagonist doesn't speak a whole lot. But regardless, it's still a great film. It's very heavy and at times can be very difficult to get through, but despite its flaws, I think it is truly amazing. It addresses a lot of themes very well, and despite my gripes about its theme of redemption, I think it is still a good theme to address. Ultimately, I think the bigger purpose of this film is learning to live life despite its challenges. In the end, Robert finds meaning in his life despite the death around him. Visually, it is an absolutely stunning film with a lot of green and very lush colors. The performances for being sort of underground actors are pretty good, along with the writing being, also pretty good. It may not be one of my favorite films, nor would I classify it as a modern classic, but it is a film that has a number of good lessons and will definitely stir up some emotions. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.